This presentation kind of goes along towards the tail end of population genetics and population evolution, because this is going to talk about the mechanisms that can actually cause change. So the drivers behind the idea of Hardy-Weinberg not being in equilibrium. So one of those major changes, or all of them, are kind of listed here. So how does evolution happen in populations? We already talked about natural selection. And one of the criteria for the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is that no selection can take place. So if it does, well, then the population is evolving. The other ones I want to just mention here are genetic drift, gene flow, and again, mutation. Just understanding the idea that natural selection alone is not the only way. But it is a mechanism that does cause adaptations to happen, where survival of the fittest occurs and the favoring alleles can then change over time to the more well-suited organisms. But I do want to talk about the others. So, genetic drift has to do with kind of random changes over time. So, for example, if I have a population of flowers on the left, for whatever reason, only the 5 highlighted ones might leave offspring. And then of those, only 2 of the 10 plants have offspring. And so over time, what happens is this kind of drifting. There was a dominant and recessive allele. The dominant one was purple or pinkish purple, and the recessive one was white. And in the beginning, it was a 0.7 to 0.3 breakdown. But then based on that first round of reproduction, it ended up shifting a little bit by random chance. And we were kind of at 0.5 and 0.5. And then it happened that only the dominant ones reproduced in this particular generation. And then that yielded, essentially, now we're locked in to that fixed allele situation where every member of the population is homozygous dominant. So we've lost the recessive allele. So this is the basic premise of genetic drift. It's changes in the gene pool, and usually it's a small population. This happens less with larger populations, and it's just due to chance. So there's a couple examples of genetic drift. The first is called bottleneck. And what that means is you kind of have an original population, and for some reason, there's some kind of event or some kind of sudden change in the environment that causes the population to go way down. And so then you only have a super small surviving population, but because of that, you have very reduced genetic diversity compared to what you had before. So one of the hallmark examples of that is cheetahs. There was a disease that kind of popped through the cheetah population, or they were hunted to almost extinction. There was a very limited number left, and they kind of used that small size to rebuild the population. But even though they might be increasing in numbers, they are severely lacking genetic diversity because much of that genetic diversity has been eliminated over time. Prairie chicken population also in Illinois is another example where when you kill off or eliminate most of the organisms, well, then you don't have a lot of genetic diversity to work with. So that's called bottleneck effect. Another example is called the founder effect. And this really has to do a lot of times with like islands. So it's where a very few individuals go off and colonize an isolated area. And that small, unique group of individuals and their inherent genetic diversity are then responsible for kind of all of the new genetic diversity that occurs. And so that's where things like inbreeding can occur because you have only a small subset of individuals now reproducing with one another. And again, you're not really getting a good genetic diversity. So the Galapagos finches are a good example of this. They had kind of the original population on the mainland. They all went off to different islands. And therefore, based on the ones that did go to different islands, you end up with very different founder populations and differences in allele frequencies. So genetic drift has a lot of conclusions. It can cause random changes in allele frequencies based on chance. It affects small populations a lot more. And it can lead to a couple of things. It can lead to a loss of genetic variation. You might even lose an allele altogether. Harmful alleles can become fixed, meaning if in any of these examples, all of the individuals have a particular disease or an allele that can cause a disease, because of the low population and the continued reproduction, it can become fixed by chance. And it's not adaptive. It's by random chance, so it's not necessarily occurring because individuals are most fit for the environment. Okay, another idea is gene flow. This is another non-adaptive thing that is occurring. Gene flow has to do with just migration of individuals between populations. So it's not the result of a bottleneck, and it's not really the result of a founder effect, because founder is really where it goes where it hasn't been before. Gene flow is just from one population to another. So I don't know, if Americans went over to England, for example, that could be an gene flow. Or when our ancestors colonized America, that would be a gene flow, so to speak. In the picture here, we have a brown beetle going into a green beetle population. So it can alter the allele frequency and also introduce new alleles into populations where maybe it wasn't before. It can combine populations that were maybe isolated. And as I mentioned, humans have a way of doing this because we travel throughout the world and remain in multiple areas. Mutation can happen immediately, and we've learned that before. It can alter the P and Q in a population. Mutations are the original source of variation. It happens by random chance, so it is not an adaptive thing. And depending on if it's good or bad, it can then have consequences in terms of the allele frequencies in a population. And then we have non-random mating. As I alluded to before, artificial selection is one thing, but this can also go against the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and cause evolution. This is just kind of prearranged evolution. So things like sexual selection and inbreeding. Selfing is one example. A lot of plants might do this, where they pollinate themselves. Assortative mating, where individuals might choose mates that are more like themselves. Peacock feathers are the clear example of sexual selection, so it kind of drives evolution. Male peacocks do not like dragging those feathers around, but the brighter, most beautiful peacock is the one that gets to mate. So that can kind of drive selection in a certain way. All right, so that kind of concludes the idea of different ways in which you can break the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and ways in which evolution is driven in different populations.